I never thought I would be the kind of person to tell a story like this. I spent 42 years working as a machinist in Traverse City, Michigan, raised 3 kids, paid my mortgage on time, and never asked for much beyond a quiet life and a few weeks of hunting season every fall. I'm not someone who believes in things I can't see or touch. I'm not the type to get worked up over shadows or sounds in the woods. But what happened in October of 2019 changed something fundamental in the way I understand the world. And I've spent the last few years trying to reconcile what I know with what I saw. I'm telling this now because I'm tired of carrying it alone, and because I think people who spend time in the northern forests deserve to know that there are things out there that don't fit into any category we've been taught to recognize. This isn't a ghost story, and it's not folklore. This is what happened to me and 2 men I've known for over 30 years, and I still don't have an explanation that makes sense. My hunting group has been going to the same area of the Manistee National Forest since the early 90s. It's a section of dense hardwood and pine about 15 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by logging trails that most people wouldn't risk in anything but a truck with high clearance. We've had the same routine for decades. We drive in on the Friday before rifle season opens, set up a base camp near a creek that runs through a clearing, and spend the weekend tracking whitetail through terrain we know as well as our own backyards. There are 3 of us. Myself, a man named Dale who worked in construction until his knees gave out, and a younger guy named Chris who grew up in the area and learned to hunt from his grandfather. We're not the kind of hunters who drink too much or take unnecessary risks. We follow the rules, respect the land, and we've never had a serious incident in all the years we've been going out there. That changed in 2019, and none of us have been back since. We arrived at the trailhead late on a Friday afternoon in mid-October. The weather was cold but clear, with temperatures in the low 40s and no rain in the forecast. The leaves were mostly down, and the forest had that open skeletal quality that makes tracking easier, but also makes you feel more exposed. We loaded our gear into the truck bed and started the slow drive in, following the old logging road that winds through the forest for miles before reaching the area where we usually camp. The road was rougher than I remembered, with deep ruts and fallen branches that we had to clear by hand in a few places. It took us almost 2 hours to cover the distance, and by the time we reached the clearing, the sun was low and the shadows were starting to stretch across the forest floor. The clearing looked the same as it always did. A flat open space about 60 feet across, bordered by thick pine and oak, with the creek running along the eastern edge. We'd camped there so many times that we had our setup routine down to a science. Dale and I pitched the tents while Chris gathered firewood and set up the cooking area. We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of doing the same task together, and within an hour we had a fire going and coffee brewing. The forest was quiet, but not unusually so. We could hear the creek, the occasional rustle of wind in the trees, and the distant calls of crows settling in for the night. Everything felt normal, familiar, safe. We spent the evening preparing for the next day's hunt, checking our rifles, reviewing the areas we planned to cover, and discussing the wind patterns and deer movement we'd observed in previous years. Chris mentioned that he'd heard from a friend who hunted a few miles south that there had been fewer deer this season, and that some of the locals were saying the population had shifted east toward the agricultural areas. We didn't think much of it at the time. Deer populations fluctuate, and we'd had lean years before. Dale made a joke about us getting old and slow, and we laughed and drank our coffee and watched the fire until it burned down to coals. Around 9 o'clock, we turned in. I remember lying in my sleeping bag that first night, listening to the sounds of the forest, feeling content and relaxed. I had no reason to think the weekend would be anything other than what it had always been. The next morning, we were up before dawn. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was frost on the tents and a thin layer of ice along the edges of the creek. We ate a quick breakfast of oatmeal and instant coffee, geared up and headed out in different directions. The plan was to cover a triangular area with each of us taking a different section, then meet back at camp around noon to compare notes. I took the western route, following a ridge that overlooked a hollow where we'd seen deer before. Dale headed north into a section of dense pine, and Chris went east toward an old clear cut that had regrown into thick brush. We all carried handheld radios, but the terrain and tree cover made communication spotty at best. We agreed to check in every hour if possible, and to return to camp if anyone got into trouble. I spent the morning moving slowly through the forest, watching for tracks and signs of recent deer activity. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I found a few prints near a game trail, but nothing fresh. The woods were quiet in a way that felt slightly off, though I couldn't pinpoint why. There were no birds calling, no squirrels moving through the canopy, just the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of branches overhead. I've hunted long enough to know that forests go silent sometimes, usually when a predator is nearby, but I assumed it was just a coyote or maybe a fox moving through the area. I kept going, following the ridge for about 2 miles before looping back toward camp. I reached the clearing a little after 11. Dale was already there, sitting by the fire with a thermos of coffee. He looked tired, and when I asked him how his morning went, he shook his head and said he hadn't seen anything. No deer, no fresh tracks, nothing. He also mentioned that the forest felt wrong to him, though he couldn't explain what he meant by that. I told him I'd felt the same thing, and we sat there for a while, not saying much, just waiting for Chris to get back. By noon, Chris still hadn't returned. We tried reaching him on the radio, but all we got was static. Dale suggested we give him another 30 minutes, and I agreed. Chris was younger and faster than us, and he often ranged farther than we did. It wasn't unusual for him to be late. By 12:30, we were starting to get concerned. We tried the radio again, and this time we heard a faint response, broken and hard to make out, but it sounded like Chris saying he was on his way back. We relaxed a little, figuring he'd just gotten farther out than he'd planned. But when 1 o'clock came and went with no sign of him, we decided to go looking. We packed light, took our rifles, and headed east in the direction he'd gone that morning. The terrain in that area is rough, with thick underbrush and fallen trees that make walking slow and exhausting. We called his name as we went, and every few minutes we'd stop and listen, hoping to hear him respond. We found him about 1.5 miles from camp, standing in the middle of a narrow game trail, staring into the trees. He didn't turn around when we approached, didn't acknowledge us until Dale put a hand on his shoulder and asked if he was okay. Chris looked at us then, and I could see that something was wrong. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. He told us he'd been followed for the last hour. He said something had been pacing him through the woods, staying just out of sight, moving parallel to his path no matter which direction he turned. He'd tried to get a look at it several times, but every time he stopped and scanned the trees, whatever it was would stop too, and he couldn't pinpoint its location. Dale asked him if he thought it was another hunter, and Chris shook his head. He said the movement was too deliberate, too controlled. It didn't sound like a person walking. It sounded heavier, more purposeful, and it never made the mistakes that people make when they're trying to move quietly through the forest. He also said that at one point he'd heard what sounded like breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from a stand of pines to his left. He'd raised his rifle and called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. Just silence. And then, a few minutes later, the movement started again, following him as he tried to make his way back to camp. We told him it was probably a bear or a large dog, something that had picked up his scent and was curious but not aggressive. Chris didn't argue, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We started walking back toward camp together, staying close, keeping our rifles ready. The forest was still quiet, and that wrongness I'd felt earlier was more pronounced now. It was like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. About halfway back, Dale stopped and pointed to a tree just off the trail. The bark had been stripped away in long vertical gouges, starting about 6 feet off the ground and running down to the base. The wood beneath was pale and fresh, the damage recent. We examined the marks more closely. They looked like claw marks, but they were too deep and too clean to have been made by a bear. Bears tear at bark in irregular patterns, leaving ragged edges. These gouges were almost surgical in their precision, and the spacing suggested something with a larger paw or hand than any bear I'd ever seen. Dale took a few pictures with his phone, and we continued back to camp without discussing it further. None of us wanted to say what we were all thinking. When we reached the clearing, the fire had burned down to ash, and the camp looked undisturbed. We built the fire back up, made some food, and sat there in silence for a while, each of us processing what we'd seen and felt. Chris eventually spoke up and said he didn't want to stay another night. He said whatever was out there, it wasn't a bear, and he didn't feel safe. Dale and I exchanged a look. We'd invested decades in this tradition, and the idea of packing up early felt like admitting defeat. But I also couldn't ignore the unease that had been building in my chest since that morning. We decided to compromise. We'd stay one more night, keep a watch rotation, and leave at first light if nothing else happened. The afternoon passed slowly. We stayed close to camp, keeping the fire burning, talking in low voices about nothing in particular. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped sharply, and the forest took on that deep stillness that comes just before full dark. We ate dinner in shifts, with one of us always watching the tree line. I took the first watch, sitting by the fire with my rifle across my lap, scanning the shadows beyond the clearing. The others tried to rest, but I could tell from the way they moved in their tents that neither of them was sleeping. Around 8 o'clock, I heard something. It started as a low sound, almost below the range of hearing, like a hum or a vibration in the air. Then it shifted, becoming a vocalization, a drawn-out note that didn't match anything I knew. It wasn't a howl, wasn't a growl, but something in between, with a tonal quality that made my skin crawl. The sound came from the north, somewhere beyond the pines, and it lasted maybe 10 seconds before cutting off abruptly. I didn't move. I sat there listening, waiting for it to come again. It didn't. Dale emerged from his tent a few minutes later and asked if I'd heard it too. I nodded, and he sat down beside me without saying anything else. The watch rotation continued through the night. Nothing else happened, but the silence pressed in on us, thick and oppressive. Every small sound, a branch creaking, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified and significant. I don't think any of us slept more than an hour or two. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, we packed up the camp with an efficiency born of urgency. We didn't discuss what we'd heard or what it might have been. We just loaded the truck and started the long drive back out. We were about 3 miles from the clearing, navigating a particularly narrow section of the logging road, when Dale, who was driving, hit the brakes hard enough that we all lurched forward. I looked up and saw what had made him stop. There was something lying in the middle of the road ahead of us, a dark shape that at first I thought was a fallen log or a pile of debris. But as we got closer, I realized it was an animal, a deer, or what was left of one. Dale put the truck in park but left the engine running. None of us moved for a moment. Then Chris said we should check it out, make sure it wasn't something we needed to report. I didn't want to get out of the truck, but I also knew he was right. We approached the carcass slowly, rifles in hand. The deer was a young buck, maybe a year and a half old, and it had been torn apart with a violence that didn't match anything I'd seen in over 4 decades of hunting. The neck was broken, twisted at an angle that suggested immense force. The rib cage was crushed inward, the bones splintered and exposed. There was very little blood on the ground, which struck me as strange. An animal killed by a predator usually bleeds significantly, but this looked like the deer had been killed somewhere else and then moved here, positioned deliberately in the center of the road. The body was still relatively fresh, the eyes not yet clouded, the muscles not yet stiffened. It had been killed recently, maybe within the last few hours. Dale crouched down and examined the wounds more closely. He pointed out marks along the flanks, deep parallel gouges that looked similar to what we'd seen on the tree the day before. The spacing was too wide for a coyote, too precise for a bear. Chris walked a slow circle around the carcass, looking at the ground. He found tracks leading away from the deer, heading back into the forest on the south side of the road. The prints were large, canine in shape, but wrong in proportion. The toes were elongated, the claws prominent, and the depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than a wolf. Chris took pictures, and we all stood there staring at those tracks, trying to make them fit into a category we understood. I suggested we get back in the truck and keep moving. Whatever had done this might still be nearby, and I didn't want to be standing in the open if it decided to come back. We returned to the vehicle and continued driving, but the atmosphere had shifted. The unease that had been building since the previous morning had solidified into something closer to fear. We didn't talk much for the rest of the drive. We just watched the trees, scanning for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. We reached the paved road a little after 9 in the morning. The transition from the isolation of the forest to the normal world felt surreal, like stepping from one reality into another. We stopped at a gas station in a small town about 20 miles from the trailhead, filled up the truck, and bought coffee. While we were standing outside, Dale brought up the idea of reporting what we'd found. He said we could call the DNR, tell them about the deer carcass and the unusual tracks, see if they wanted to investigate. Chris and I both hesitated. We knew how that conversation would go. They'd ask us what we thought had killed the deer, and when we said we didn't know, they'd tell us it was probably a bear or a pack of coyotes and that we shouldn't worry about it. If we pushed back, if we mentioned the tracks or the claw marks or the way the body had been positioned, we'd be labeled as paranoid or overly imaginative. I'd seen it happen before with other hunters who reported strange things. The officials would nod and take notes, and then nothing would come of it. We decided to keep it to ourselves, at least for the time being. We agreed to review the pictures and the notes we'd taken, do some research, and see if we could find any explanation that made sense. We drove back to Traverse City in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we parted ways that afternoon, there was an unspoken understanding that something had changed. The easy camaraderie we'd built over 30 years of hunting together felt strained, replaced by a shared awareness of something we couldn't name. Over the next few weeks, I tried to go about my normal routine. I went to work, spent time with my wife, avoided talking about the trip, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I kept coming back to the carcass in the road, the deliberate way it had been placed, the precision of the wounds. I started researching online, looking for reports of unusual predators in northern Michigan, animal attacks that didn't fit known species. That's when I first came across the term Dogman. I'd heard the legend before, vaguely, the way you hear about any local folklore, but I'd never taken it seriously. Now, reading through the accounts, I found descriptions that matched what we'd experienced. Bipedal canines, intelligent behavior, territorial aggression, claw marks on trees, vocalizations that didn't sound like any known animal. The consistency across different reports from different years and different locations was unsettling. I called Dale and told him what I'd found. He admitted he'd been doing the same research and had reached similar conclusions. We both felt foolish even discussing it, but the alternative was to dismiss what we'd seen, and neither of us could do that honestly. Chris was harder to reach. When I finally got him on the phone, he said he didn't want to talk about it. He said he'd decided the whole thing was explainable, that we just had a string of coincidences and let our imaginations run wild. I didn't push him. I understood the impulse to rationalize, to force the experience into a framework that allowed you to sleep at night. Dale and I met for coffee a few times over the following months. We talked about whether we should go back, whether we owed it to ourselves to try to document what was out there more thoroughly. But every time we got close to making plans, one of us would find a reason to postpone. The truth was, neither of us wanted to go back. The forest that had been a source of peace and tradition for decades now felt like hostile territory. The idea of spending a night out there, knowing that something intelligent and powerful was watching, was more than either of us could stomach. In the spring of 2020, I sold most of my hunting equipment. I told my wife I was getting too old for it, that my knees couldn't handle the terrain anymore. She accepted the explanation without question, and I was grateful for that. Dale stopped hunting altogether. He took up fishing instead, staying close to populated areas, places where the world felt predictable and safe. Chris moved to the other side of the state later that year. I don't know if the trip had anything to do with it, but I suspect it played a role. I think about that weekend often, more than I'd like to admit. I think about the silence in the forest, the way it felt like we were being evaluated. I think about the claw marks on the tree, the carcass in the road, the tracks that led back into the shadows. I think about the sound we heard that last night, the vocalization that didn't belong to anything I could name. Most of all, I think about the intelligence behind it all. Whatever was out there, it knew we were there. It watched us, followed us, tested us, and for reasons I'll never understand, it let us leave. I don't know what the Dogman is. I don't know if it's a flesh and blood animal that science hasn't documented yet, or something else entirely. I don't know how many of them are out there, or how long they've been living in those forests undetected. What I do know is that the experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to process. I used to feel at home in the woods, confident in my understanding of the natural world. Now, I feel like a guest in a place that tolerates my presence but doesn't welcome it. I'm not telling this story to convince anyone of anything. I'm not asking people to believe in creatures that mainstream science says don't exist. I'm just sharing what happened to me and two men I trusted in a place we thought we knew during a weekend that was supposed to be routine and familiar. We went into those woods with decades of experience and knowledge, and we came out with more questions than answers. The forest is still there, unchanged and indifferent. The logging roads still lead to the same clearing where we camped. The creek still runs along the eastern edge, and the pines still stand tall and silent. But I'll never go back. I've accepted that there are things in those woods that I don't understand, things that have learned to exist in the spaces between our awareness and our certainty. If you hunt or camp in the northern forests, I won't tell you to stay away. People have been using those lands for generations, and most of them never encounter anything unusual. But I will say this: pay attention to the silences. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And if you ever find yourself being followed, being watched, being tested by something you can't see, don't try to prove how brave you are. Just leave. Get back to your vehicle, get back to safety, and don't look back. Some experiences aren't worth the answers they might provide, and some mysteries are better left alone. I'm 67 now, and I don't have many years left to carry this story. I'm sharing it because I think people deserve to know that the world is larger and stranger than we've been taught to believe. The forests hold secrets that predate our cities and our certainties, and sometimes, if you're unlucky or careless, those secrets make themselves known. What you do with that knowledge is up to you, but I hope you'll treat it with the seriousness it deserves. The Dogman, or whatever it was that watched us that weekend, is real. I've seen the evidence, felt the fear, lived with the aftermath, and I know, with a certainty that I can't explain or defend, that it's still out there, moving through the shadows, waiting for the next person who strays too far from the safety of the known world.